All right, welcome everybody to the virtual presentation of emerging contaminants of concern for Lake Maxinkuckee. We first talked about this live at the Culver Union Township Library in July, but I wanted to make this recording so that anybody can view this at their convenience. I'm Adam Theta, the president of the Lake Maxinkuckee Environmental Fund. And for the last 40 years, our mission has been the preservation of an ecologically healthy Lake Maxinkuckee and its watershed. So Lake Maxinkuckee is a glacial lake in northern Indiana, the second largest natural lake. It's about 3 square miles in surface area. It's fed by 3 main tributaries. And the land area that flows into the water is about 5 times the lake surface area. So that's the amount of land that we call the watershed. Water that falls in that area flows over land or percolates through the ground and goes through groundwater to the lake. And so what happens on that land, as well as what happens in the lake, affects the quality of the lake's ecosystem. So one of the most determining factors for the health of water bodies in our areas is what the land is used for. And you can make a pretty good educated guess on the health of a lake based on what's happening in the watershed. So in our area, somewhere north of 20% of the watershed is used for cultivated crops, which we need to grow for food, but also yield some challenges relating to nutrients and sediment that can get into the waterways. Another 10% of that is in grasslands or haze or pasture, and 3 golf courses. So for some glacial lakes in this region, our level of agriculture in the watershed is fairly low, which makes it a little easier to reduce the sediments and nutrients. But we have a pretty good mix of uses within the watershed. So one thing that's important to remember when we're talking about potential contaminants is that the dose makes the poison, right? So there are 3 chemicals that you can see on the screen in front of you right now. One of these chemicals, in fact, has been found in our lake at a very high level. And when they did a survey for all of the lakes across Indiana, this chemical was found everywhere. Now, that chemical is actually dihydrogen monoxide, and it's right there in the middle of the slide, and it's also known as water. Okay, so when we use words like chemical or molecules, it's important to remember that they have scientific definitions, and then they have these kind of cultural, linguistic, emotional connections with us, and it's important to be clear about that when we're discussing these. So water can kill you if you drink too much of it, right? If you just slug 6 liters of water with no salt in there and no break, it's the lethal dose for 50% of people is chugging 6 liters of water. Your body is going to do things very quickly to prevent you from dying if you try that. Or if you go get 118 shots of espresso or drink alcohol straight, these things your body does not like. So any of these things can be consumed in moderation, but the dose makes the poison. So things are not inherently poisonous or toxic in and of themselves. It is a function of our body's ability to handle and process those chemicals. So some of the common vegetables and fruits that we eat, they have things like formaldehyde, amygdalin, solanin. All of these things that are listed that are toxic to humans are in everyday vegetables that are healthy for us because they are in quantities that our body can naturally deal with. So we don't have to worry about, don't take this as a lesson to not eat your fruits and vegetables. So just because a chemical is present doesn't mean that it is harmful in the amount it's present. So again, that's an important thing to remember when we're talking about the health of the lake. Just because we found something doesn't mean it's something we need to worry about. Or as I like to say with my kids, find out before you freak out. This is good for parents and for the kids themselves, and also for understanding the health of our lake. Find out what's actually going on before you freak out. So the first one that we're going to take a look at is a chemical called perchlorate. It's naturally occurring, particularly in arid regions in the desert southwest of the United States. We've not really done any testing historically in Culver. No municipal sources of water like the town of Culver test for this. It's not required. The concern that we would have for this is that in high doses, it can cause thyroid issues. We use this in a variety of ways: rocket propellants and fireworks, airbag initiators, all these industrial processes. The routes of exposure that we would be concerned is food and drinking water. So what sort of regulations exist to protect us? Well, the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, is currently under a court order to develop some drinking water standards based on a thorough review of the best available science. So in the United States, most of our regulation, our drinking water regulation, comes down from the federal level. So the bills that were signed into law years ago drive a lot of the things that we need to take a look at, and those inevitably go through the courts as various entities challenge them. So all we have at the state level are really guidelines. So for in Indiana, that level is 15, I believe it's nanograms per liter, or I'm sorry, probably micrograms per liter. In other states, it varies from about 1 to 71, so kind of all over the map. So we really need a federal drinking water standard, because although the states are certainly different, whether you live in Indiana or Illinois or California, your body is going to react as a member of our species similar to these chemicals. So LMEF, our organization, participated in a study last year. We were very enthusiastic participants because we got connected to a nationwide study, and all we needed to do was coordinate with them and provide a little labor and ship these samples off for testing. So this was a grant that was given by the EPA to this university to assess whether fireworks, it's very common for fireworks to be launched over water. Some of those times those reservoirs and lakes are drinking water sources. So a natural question is this a problem? We know that these fireworks have perchlorates. We know that they could get into the water. Are they there in a dose that we should be concerned about? Is there a pathway to our drinking water sources? Again, find out before you freak out. And the dose makes the poison, right? So we participated last year. We took a sample before the event, so a week before the fireworks, immediately the day after the fireworks, and then a week after the fireworks. So I had some volunteer boat captains take me out. We took our sample, we shipped it off to a lab, and they did that with 226 lakes with all different kinds of organizations. We did over 1,000 samples. So of those 1,000, 11% of those had concentrations above 1 point per billion. And then about a week after, on average, the average values were more or less unchanged, but the highest spikes went down. So that water was getting mixed. So the highest levels that maybe we were finding right on the surface water, they're getting mixed a little bit, but the perchlorate levels were still elevated a week later. So because we were in that top 11%, they invited us to participate in a follow-up study for the summer 2025. So you'll see here our results. Sample 1 was fairly low sample, and then right after the fireworks, it spiked over 1, and then a week afterwards, it went back down. So that's good. The second sample site we did on the lake, we did 2 places in the lake, it more or less stayed unchanged. So remember, the guidelines in Indiana are 15 parts per billion as a guideline for safety, and we had one reading that was above 1. So we don't know what the level is in the aquifer. We don't do testing on that. It's not something I'm particularly concerned about with these values, but it's definitely something that we want to continue to research and study, because a lot of these compounds that we've studied in the past, we have found that become worse and worse to human health based on our increasing knowledge. So we thought something was relatively inert and harmless, and then we found out that it was pretty bad, and we started passing laws to remove those things from our economy, right? From our way of being. Other things, not so much. So we need to know if this is a good one or a bad one, right? So unfortunately, we then got the news this May. I was emailing with the researchers saying, hey, when can we get this going? We're excited. Uh, the project got terminated right in the middle of the project. It was terminated by the federal government, along with thousands of other grant cancellations at universities across the country. And as you all have probably read in the news, this was Elon Musk's Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE, that seemingly cut research across the federal government on large swaths that didn't seem related to any particular focus. These were scientific or investigations on human health. There wasn't a lot of explanation, just kind of terminated. So, let's not let me go back. So let me finish up with perchlorate first. So unfortunately, we're just going to not know. That's kind of the price. Like we can say that we are going to save money by not hiring these graduate students, and that may be true. But unfortunately, we're just not going to know about perchlorates at this point. So until that research gets reinstated, or we want to do more with that, it's just kind of the price we're going to have to pay as members of the public. So let's go on to number 2, PFAS or PFOS, aka forever chemicals. You probably have heard of this as well. This stands for per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. No, you don't have to remember that, but there are 15,000 kinds of these that have been created for all kinds of uses, for nonstick cookware, stain and water resistant fabrics for clothing and furniture, cosmetics, and especially firefighting foam. So this is one of those things where the biggest human health concerns have been for those that have specific occupational risks, like firefighters, or those who are by these manufacturing facilities, like I believe it's the Wolverine boot company that was making boots north of Grand Rapids, Michigan, and they found plumes of this chemical in the groundwater, and it was particularly of concern. But as these chemicals make their way into consumer products, they then become present at a low level throughout our environment, even in very remote locations. These are carried by wind and water and erosion. The concern for these chemicals, they're still under research, but it's one of those that seems bad. Everything we keep looking into about this seems to be worse and worse. Increased thyroid disease and cancer risk, cholesterol levels, negative impacts on fertility and fetal health. To say nothing of the ecological effects of PFAS, its impacts on wild plants and animals, insects, our crops, is very much in its infancy and needs further study. So in order to figure out what these things are doing, we have to fund the research to do those things. And we're doing that for humans, and very little of that has gone into understanding the ecological effects. So I did mention routes of exposure, but that can be through drinking water, and it can be bioaccumulated up the food chain. So because these chemicals are so solid and unreactive, and that is the reason we are using these for those purposes, our bodies are then not able to break those down, and they don't break down in the environment, right? So if it gets accumulated in a fish, and a bigger fish eats that fish, it accumulates all of those in its tissues, and so it concentrates them because it's eating a fish every day, right? And then we eat that predatory fish, and then it accumulates in our body. So even though the levels may be low in the environment generally, they can accumulate up the food chain. So this is kind of a map showing the routes of and you can pause it here if you want to take a closer look, or Google the description there to take a look at how those move through the environment. So fortunately in Indiana, Purdue University coordinated a statewide assessment for PFAS, and it was just published this year. Been keeping tabs on this and watched a presentation on it. It is an overview of the current state of scientific knowledge about PFAS and its specific interest in Indiana in terms of the industries that we have and the regions where we might have these exposures. So in Indiana, the Indiana Department of Environmental Management, or IDEM, received a grant to research this. So they received a federal grant from the EPA to look at small or disadvantaged communities like the town of Culver and other towns within Marshall County to just check for PFAS and see what the concerns are. So there are a couple, excuse me, let me go back a little bit. Oh, it's not letting me go back. So unfortunately, it looks like I can only go forward with this presentation, and I'm not going to do this presentation multiple times. So anyway, it started in 2021, and they went and sampled all kinds of different water bodies and all different kinds of public water supplies for towns throughout Indiana. In the course of that, they sampled Culver Military Academy, the town of Culver Water Department, and several other facilities within the county. And the good news is there was no PFAS detected at all. Not only in the original source of the water, like in the aquifer, but also they tested at the tap where you get the water out at your house. So no PFAS was also, inadvertently added during the processing of that water. So that's great news, right? And again, the dose makes the poison. So just because they detected it does not mean that you would need to freak out. And if you go buy bottled water, as you learn, that's not a guarantee just because you buy water in a bottle that it's free of PFAS or microplastics. That certainly is not a good reason to just go buy bottled water. So they were also going to test surface water bodies, but unfortunately, for our purposes, this is only surface water bodies in Indiana that are used as public drinking water supplies. So because we don't use Lake Maxinkuckee as a public source of drinking water, it was not tested. So if you look at the list of the places that were tested, they did detect PFAS in about half of the surface water areas that they tested. Now, again, the dose makes the poison, right? So the next column says, are PFAS surface water sample results above the maximum containment level, I think is what MCL stands for drinking water. So is it above that level that we need to be concerned? And so only a fraction of those in yellow that I highlighted are above the level that we need to start being concerned. And then the next column says, are PFAS results above that level for the finished treated drinking water? Are they above that level? And none of those tested. So can kind of conclude from this that at the moment, we are in a fairly good state in Indiana in terms of PFAS and our public drinking water supply. Now, again, some of these routes of exposure are ongoing. So this is something that we need to continue to pay attention to and understand, because if this thing is, every time we study it, if it gets more and more, if we realize it's more and more toxic, our standards need to keep increasing, right? So here's a map of 4 different kinds of forever chemicals that they tested and where they detected them and what level. You can pause the video and take a closer look at that if you'd like. So what about ecological impacts? This is a picture of, let me see if I can point to it. This is a picture of the DNR stocking, probably walleye in Lake Maxinkuckee. So what we read from the report is that there are some fish in Indiana water bodies that have a level that requires reducing their consumption. So this is a common thing for those who eat fish and are fishermen, that you only eat at a certain water bodies, a certain types of fish, because of the way they accumulate, say, lead or mercury. You only want to have so many of those meals a week or a month or a year, right? Especially if you're in a sensitive group, like if you're pregnant. So there are a couple places down in Cass County and Blackford County where there's some fish consumption guidelines. And again, the dose makes the poison, right? So does this mean that because there was PFAS detected in this water body one time, that you should never eat any fish out of there? No, that is not, in my opinion, that is not necessarily science-based advice. You can be extremely cautious to the nth degree if you so wish, but there are many other hazards in our life that we would never go to that extreme amount of precaution for. So let's take a look at the federal status of regulation with PFAS. So back in February of 2020, this would have been during the first Trump administration, the EPA announced that they will start regulating the toxic forever chemicals. These have been in the news for a long time. They've got people concerned, and so they're using their authority as granted to them by Congress to start the process to regulate these things. And it is a long process, right? Because the science evolves, and then we have to have ways to treat it, and then those ways have to be implemented at all of these often small water supply facilities, and it can be very expensive, perhaps prohibitively expensive. So there needs to be investment into new technologies. There needs to be special grants and loans made available. It is a whole long process, multi years for sure. So fast forward to the Biden administration, the bipartisan infrastructure law provided $9 billion for communities that were impacted by PFAS. So probably not the ones that we have discussed in Marshall County would not qualify those because it's not a particularly known concern for us. That money would probably flow to those who have documented concerns. So this is a pretty normal trajectory so far, right? You propose the regulation based on the science indicating that this is a concern. You fund, the research, science, the ways to implement this, and you start developing standards. So in April of 2024, at the end of the Biden administration, the EPA is proposing these final regulations, enforceable regulations for different types of forever chemicals. So you look at the goal of what they want the drinking water to be, and then not quite as strict as the final legal, you cannot give water to people above 4 parts per trillion or 10 parts per trillion. So these are very toxic chemicals. They have to be filtered down to a very low level. We're talking parts per trillion. I believe I listened to a news story, and it was like 1 drop in 5 Olympic swimming pools or something. Don't quote me on that. You can fact check me on that. But it's a very, very small amount, and it's very difficult and expensive for municipalities to do. So then they would have years to implement this. So unfortunately, with this massive cutting of scientific research in the beginning part of this year, at the beginning of the second Trump administration, these cancellations also hit a lot of the research and implementation for PFAS, for the forever chemicals. Those were for pending and active grants, so people that were in the middle of the research. And unfortunately, that was a form of waste, because if you do half a research, it's like building half a house and not putting a roof on top of it, right? You maybe have saved money from not paying for the roof, but then you've just wasted the rest of the house. So unfortunately for those researchers, a lot of this stuff got cut right in the middle, and it's uncertain whether those studies can then be completed in the future if this is ever reinstated. And then it became clear that this was not just a single study or just one particular researcher or university, but it was across the country was happening. And it's uncertain, and it does not appear that PFAS research in particular was targeted. This was part of a very broad defunding of scientific efforts across the country. Here's one from University of North Carolina. And then after I gave this talk in public, I had an LMEF member send me this. Changing regulations on the ability to spread sewage sludge on farms. So what happens with municipal water treatment plants is that they're processing sewage from a town. They get as much out of that as they can, and they're left with dry biosolids, which is another way of kind of saying like human manure, right? and they can either landfill that or they can spread it on farmers' fields. Now, there's rules around that, obviously, because concerns of things that we're passing through our bodies and then putting right back. If you put it on the farmer's field, that's then going right back in the watershed, right? So it is potentially getting into the soil and then the groundwater and into the river systems and the lakes. So the subtitle for this article was "Regulations Prohibiting the Practice Were Written During the Final Days of the Biden Administration," and now there's an effort at dialing that back. At the state level, has been interesting. Now, again, the state doesn't have as large a role to play as the federal government, but Attorney General Todd Rokita, back in 2024, launched a massive lawsuit against the manufacturers of forever chemicals. Excuse me. I'm unsure if this was a part of a larger national effort among state attorneys general, or whether it was a particular one within Indiana. So I don't know that fact, but there's this follows a pretty established trend of what happens in the U.S. You saw this with Rachel Carson and DDT back in the 60s when she was doing research and showing that the pesticide DDT had widespread impact on birds of prey like the bald eagles and osprey that we have on Lake Maxinkuckee today. And I've blogged about this. She was dismissed. Chemical companies ran a smear campaign against her. People said it was perfectly fine. They had politicians sprinkling DDT poison on their breakfast cereal. Into those crazy things. So unfortunately, with the motivation, with the people have a vested economic interest in not changing the status quo. That's what these lawsuits are going to figure out: who knew what, when, and whether they had an influence on whether changing the protections to the public from these chemicals. So from our friends next door in Kosciuszko County at the Lilly Center for Lakes and Streams at Grace College, they write, they produce a ton of great information about glacial lakes in northern Indiana. And the question's asked, should I be concerned about PFAS while I'm enjoying local lakes? Their advice is it mostly occurs through drinking, not through absorbing this through the skin, right? So they say don't drink lake water, but that's for many other reasons other than PFAS, right? So the way we're exposed to it and accumulate lake recreation is not an activity of concern. So even if we did see PFAS technically discovered in Lake Maxinkuckee, that would not prevent me. I would not hesitate to take my family to the beach, the next week. That's not a concern for me. It is more those acute sources of where they're being manufactured or stored that would need to be concerned. And I believe in that assessment. We don't have those manufacturing places within Indiana, which is kind of surprising because of how much we rely on manufacturing, especially up by Lake Michigan. But fortunately, that is not something we have to deal with at acute level. So moving to our last one, microplastics. So what is plastic, right? It's just repeating chains of carbon atoms made from oil and natural gas. Nearly 80% of all plastics ever created has been accumulating in the environment, right? So every environmental field survey that looks for microplastics has failed. Everyone has found microplastics. That nobody that has looked for it has failed to detect it. So we live in a very plastic world. It's everywhere. The shirt that I was wearing at the time I gave this presentation was made of recycled plastic. The one I'm wearing now probably does. It is a very useful arrangement of carbon atoms, as we found, to replace and lighten a lot of things that we use steel for medical devices, for convenience, and we've kind of become a victim of our own success, that we have perhaps overused this product and now seeing some of the downsides, right? So microplastics are nothing more complicated than just small pieces of plastics. And people have created a whole list of micro versus nano versus whatever, but plastics tend to not biodegrade and tend to just get chopped into smaller and smaller pieces until they can start getting in your bloodstream and your lungs and everything else. And it's a concern because not necessarily because of the plastics themselves, but the plastics can be carriers for all these other contaminants like PFAS. So one of the routes that PFAS gets into is it's hitching a ride on these tiny pieces of plastic that are everywhere. And so our routes of exposure are typically food and drinking water, and we really have no federal or state regulation for microplastics at the moment. So here's a little schematic. You can pause this if you want to see that the routes of transmission through the environment of microplastics. So basically all large plastic debris will ultimately degrade into smaller particles during use when they're getting abraded or rubbed against or exposed to UV light that breaks it down. And these other quotes that I just read from the last slide. So a lot of our studies have been focused on the big patches of plastic that we see in the ocean, right? Not as much focused on freshwater systems in Indiana. So fortunately, we had in 2018 our first ever baseline measurement of the concentration and types of microplastics in major Indiana waterways. This was funded by the Indiana Water Resources Research Council through the USGS grant. So again, coming back to federal grants, this is just how we've done science in the United States for a long time. This is how science gets funded. And the results from this, these are the watersheds that they looked at. It's hard to see from this map because we're used to looking at county lines and state lines, but there's Lake Michigan. So go south and a little to the east, and you will see the Tippecanoe River watershed. So all these different, they sampled 3 very different types of watersheds. All right, I'm trying to splice in the recording on this slide, so my apologies if it gets a little jumbled, but so what they found in this study, they found plastic in all the river systems that they sampled in Indiana. Interestingly enough, land use within those watersheds did not really influence the microplastic concentration or type. So take that as a positive or a negative. You know, it's basically everywhere, no matter whether it's heavily forested area like in the Hoosier National Forest or whether it's a heavy ag area or every urban area. Their suggestion is that microplastics may predominantly be transported through atmospheric deposition. Yes, it's raining microplastics, whether in the actual rain or whether in the wind. They're ubiquitous everywhere. Their conclusion is that the sources, pathways, and transport of these still is fairly poorly understood. They're just concerned that a lot of these things are basically going underreported and understudied. So again, this is one of those situations. Although plastics are certainly not new, our understanding of them is continuing to evolve, and we need to continue, to study this. And here's the actual research article if you want to pause it and look that up. So what solutions do we have for all of this microplastic? Well, one, we need to stop the input or reduce the input and preserve plastic for the uses that it's truly beneficial to humanity for economics and medical applications where there really aren't many alternatives or very poor alternatives. The fact that I keep getting addicted to this, gas station iced coffee drink where I'm throwing out a plastic one every day. That's something that's obviously not necessary for me, but I continue to do. So I think we can all do better in that regard in trying to reduce the amount of plastic that we have. There are some efforts going towards bioremediation, basically using biology, plants, bacteria to break down plastics. That's still very, very in the early stage. But again, like with so many of these things, individual actions is useful for those individuals, and that helps. We can all do something. But again, this is a long-term structural issue, so we need, federal and state university coordinated efforts to understand and implement alternatives and appropriate regulation for all of these. The more that they look, that researchers are looking, we're finding that certain types of life, like bacteria, fungi, and plants, can actually consume plastic. So whether that will be a panacea and a help remains yet to be seen, but certainly something we need to research more into. So, putting these three together, um, we do have to have this coordinated effort. So the headlines right now are pretty frustrating. It's really hard to see the logic behind a lot of these big cuts at research institutions and the EPA. For example, just recently, since I recorded this talk, the EPA has announced that they're going to shut down their scientific research arm. At the start of the year, this office had 1,000 to 2,000 scientists at labs distributed across the country. It provided a lot of the work that was the basis for the regulations that were implemented. And they were doing research on these various chemicals' impact on human health and the environment, to everything from air quality to climate change, planning for emergency response for contamination. So I'm sure the EPA is maybe going to put out a release about how this isn't going to affect our health, but it has the burden of proof is on them to determine how this will not negatively impact us for the long term, to reduce the funding and interest in the research for these contaminants of concern. So in the meantime, we will have to continue to be sharing research that's being done, whether that's to the extent that that's still done in the United States, universities or others internationally, to share and disseminate that information and continue to advocate for policies and protections for our natural areas like Lake Maxinkuckee. Some other items of concern that I've talked with people about that we just simply didn't have time to get into at this point. Pesticides, typically from agricultural, row crop production, but sometimes at residences as well. Not many lake organizations test for those, very, very few. And most of the particularly nasty ones have been phased out at this point because of the EPA and other regulations that they find alternatives. Salt is another one. Again, the dose makes the poison, right? So you need a little salt in your diet, but too much blanketing the roads every winter, so that we can fly down the roads at the same speed without increasing our trip an extra 2 minutes. That certainly has an impact because it not only gets into our waterways, but it actually accumulates, and we don't have a solution for it yet. Just like we don't have too many perfect alternatives for road salting. There are some alternatives, and there are ways we can mitigate and reduce that, which we've talked about. Our organization, also something we need to work on. And petroleum products, that is, oil-based things. Those are more local spills or manufacturing that we'd be looking at that aren't typically a concern here. So I hope you've enjoyed this presentation and you learned something. You can certainly go back and pause and look up certain things, or just write me a note, email me if you want the links to any of those particular reports, and I'll send those right over. Here's our phone and email address and website. We are a 501c3 nonprofit organization. We exist completely on voluntary donations. So if you would like to contribute to our work, please go to lakemax.org and you'll find a donate button right there. And we certainly appreciate you joining our efforts to understand and protect Lake Maxinkuckee for future generations. So thank you for attending this virtual presentation. Love to hear what you think.